The last of the autumn light had not yet left the sky when the door to Senna's house came off its hinges. She was at the table with her maps spread open and a half-eaten piece of bread beside her hand when the wood split inward. 3 men, large, moving with the deliberate calm of wolves who expected no resistance and had prepared for it anyway. The one at the front was the kind of broad that filled a doorframe without trying. Senna was on her feet before the door finished falling. "Sit down," the first man said. She didn't sit. She put the table between herself and the 3 of them and kept her hands where she could move them quickly, cataloging the room the way she always did when things went wrong. The knife on the shelf behind her, the window to the left, the distance to the back door. Her wolf stirred beneath her skin, that low particular alertness that preceded real danger, and she let it settle without shifting. 3 against 1, indoors, in the dark. Different calculation. "Where is she?" Senna said. Not a question. She already knew. Nell had been expected before sunset, and it was well past that now, and the 3 men standing in her ruined doorway carried the mark of Lord Varric's territory on them. She could place it with certainty, that specific combination of cold river clay and something burnt underneath that clung to anyone who spent time in those lands. The first man smiled. It was the smile of someone who had been told the conversation would go this way and found it mildly satisfying to be right. "Lord Varric extends his greetings," he said, "and his terms." The terms were simple in their cruelty. Nell was being held at Varric's fort to the northeast, a day's hard ride from where Senna stood. She would remain there, unharmed, for as long as Senna cooperated. If Senna deviated from what was being asked of her, a rider would reach the fort well ahead of any rescue attempt. If she failed to present herself for the assignment by first light, the same outcome. If she told anyone what had been asked of her, the same. The assignment itself took longer to explain. The Alpha King was traveling through the region. His route would take him through the Ash Corridor, a stretch of dense forest and rocky highland running between the border territories and the Crescent Passage to the east. He needed a guide, someone who knew the corridor's shifting terrain and could be hired quietly, without the formality of official channels. Senna had that reputation. She had built it carefully over 5 years of taking work that other guides considered beneath them, or too dangerous to bother with. The route they wanted her to use was called the Valley Road. It ran through the lower section of the corridor, wide and navigable in dry weather. It also ran directly through a natural choke point where Lord Varric had positioned 100 warriors on the ridgeline above, waiting. The Alpha King would enter the valley. He would not leave it. Senna stood very still while the first man finished speaking. Her wolf was doing something she had no name for. Not the straightforward calculation of threat assessment, but something stranger and less comfortable. A kind of resistance she felt deep in her chest that had nothing to do with the men standing across the table. "You have someone in the corridor," she said, watching for deviation. The first man's expression shifted slightly. Pleased, or something close to it. "A scout. He reports twice a day. You take the group onto any path that isn't the Valley Road. Lord Varric will know within hours. And Nell. And the girl. Yes." The 3 of them left shortly after, satisfied the terms had landed. Senna stood in the broken doorway for a moment after they were gone, looking out at the dark. The night was cold and clear. Somewhere in the forest line to the north, an owl called once and went silent. She went back inside and started looking for the one who had stayed behind. There was always one who stayed behind. She found him pressed into the narrow space beside her woodpile, waiting to see if she would run. He was younger than the others, and the fear coming off him was something her wolf tracked without effort. She didn't give him time to recover his composure. What she pulled from him in the next several minutes was worth considerably more than what the first man had intended to share. Lord Varric's operation against the Alpha King was not simply about removing a powerful obstacle. Caden had been investigating a pattern of attacks on smaller packs along the trade routes, alphas who had died in what was being officially attributed to rogue activity. The attacks were consistent in method and had been used to absorb the smaller pack's territorial rights into Varric's holdings. The Alpha King had been building a case. He was close to having enough to act. If Caden reached the Crescent Passage and delivered his findings to the Eastern Council, Varric's entire operation would be exposed. If Caden died in the Ash Corridor in what appeared to be a rogue ambush, The investigation died with him. There was more. Varric had people inside the Alpha King's own council. Not many, but positioned well enough to ensure that certain information moved in directions it shouldn't, and that certain reports arrived incomplete. Senna pressed until she had as many names as the young man knew, then let him go with the clear suggestion that leaving the region immediately was in his considerable interest. She stood in her back room for a long time after his footsteps faded. Nell was 13 years old. She was afraid of thunderstorms and had strong opinions about the correct way to braid hair, and had been sleeping in this house, in the room at the end of the hall, since she was 4 years old when their mother stopped coming back. She had been taken, and that was the entire and total shape of Senna's available options. Senna went to her maps. She spread every chart she owned across the table and worked through the night. The Ash Corridor was her territory in the way very few places were. She had guided routes through it in 3 seasons, walked every major path and most of the minor ones, knew where the ground shifted and where it held, and where the ridgelines gave advantage to someone who needed it. The Valley Road was the obvious route for a group of the Alpha King's size. The ridgeline positions above it were solid ground and naturally concealed. 100 warriors, well placed, would have everything they needed. There was no clean alternative. The routes that bypassed the valley entirely added days, not hours. The northern flank path through the high ground above the valley was passable. She had used it twice, alone, and once in worse conditions than current. It was narrow and exposed. She filed it away not as a solution but as a fact, the kind of fact you keep separate and return to when everything else has been exhausted. At some point before dawn, she stopped working and sat with her hands flat on the table. 3 days in the corridor, 1 scout reporting twice daily. Nell in a fort a day northeast with no way to reach her before the mission was already underway. She had 3 days to find something that didn't yet exist. She packed before first light and went to meet the Alpha King. Caden's camp was set in the cleared ground east of the border marker, organized with a precision that spoke of people who traveled constantly and had stopped performing the parts of military protocol that were purely ceremonial. No banners, no visible markers of rank. 6 people moving around a central fire with the economy of a group that trusted its own competence. Senna stopped at the edge of the tree line and read the camp for a full minute before stepping into the open. 4 warriors in positions that were not quite casual. 1 beta. She could read the hierarchy in the way they held themselves relative to the others, the subtle angles of deference, the tuned alertness that marked rank even in stillness. And then the 6th. She had known she would be meeting the Alpha King. She had spent the entire walk from her house preparing for that specific fact. It had not been sufficient preparation. He stood near the fire with his back partially toward her, speaking to the beta in a low voice. And what reached her first was not his size, though he was large, or his bearing, though it was the kind that required no announcement. What reached her moved through her wolf-like sound, travels through stone. Felt before it could be understood. A recognition without basis. A certainty with no precedent she could point to. Her step faltered. Only the one. She recovered before anyone turned. By the time the beta looked over and found her at the edge of camp, she was standing still and composed, her face carrying nothing except the patience of someone waiting to be acknowledged. Caden turned a moment later. His eyes found her immediately. Amber gold and unhurried, and carrying the steady, assessing focus of someone accustomed to making assessments that matter. The morning light caught the dark planes of his face. The short beard, the jaw set in the way of a person long familiar with their own decisions. He read her in the span of a few seconds, with the thoroughness of a wolf who trusted what his senses gathered. Her own wolf responded in a way she had no framework for. Not threat recognition, not the instinct to establish hierarchy with another shifter. Something with no clean label, a directional pull, like standing at a crossroads and knowing without reasoning which path leads north. It pressed against the inside of her ribs and did not care that she had no time for it. She buried it, pushed it below the part of her mind that needed to function clearly for the next 3 days. The pull didn't vanish, but it receded to something manageable. The way a person learns to move through pain when stopping is not available to them. "You're the guide," Caden said. "Senna, I know the corridor well." "I was told." He looked at her a moment longer in that thorough way. "We leave within the hour. The beta's name was Davin. He found her while she was checking the supply packs and offered information with the directness of someone who believed in useful exchange. He asks questions, Davin said. Always questions. Answer them straight. Don't manage what he thinks about the answers. He reads that kind of thing immediately. Understood, Senna said. Davin gave her a brief evaluating look, reserved judgment, and walked away. Senna tightened the strap on her pack and looked toward the dark tree line of the corridor. The forest waited in the early gray of morning, dense and indifferent. Somewhere beyond it, the valley held its ridgeline positions and its 100 waiting men and its clean solution to a problem she had been assigned without consent. She had carried harder things than this. She had not carried anything quite like this. The camp broke efficiently around her. When Caden moved past her toward the tree line and said without turning, "Walk with me. I want to know what we're walking into." Senna fell into step at his side and began describing the corridor in the flat, detailed way she used when accuracy mattered more than impression. She described every true thing she knew about it. She said nothing about the valley. Her wolf kept its bearing fixed on him with the stubborn, unwanted precision of a compass needle that has found its north and cannot be argued out of it. She kept her voice level and her face forward and told herself that 3 days was a long time. The ash corridor closed around them before the morning had properly started. The tree line swallowed the last of the open ground, and the light changed immediately, filtered now through a dense canopy of old growth that had been standing long enough to develop opinions about the sky. The path narrowed to single file within the first quarter mile. Senna moved at the front without needing to be told, reading the ground with the automatic attention of someone who had walked terrain like this until it became a second language. She could hear Caden directly behind her, not because he was loud. He was not loud at all, which was its own kind of information, but because her wolf had apparently decided to track his exact position at all times, regardless of whether she asked it to. It was the same directional pull from that morning, more settled now, as though proximity had allowed it to find a comfortable frequency and anchor there. She ignored it with the focused determination she usually reserved for physical pain. The first hour passed in near silence. The warriors moved well. Davin set a pace at the rear that communicated exactly how much ground they needed to cover before midday, and everyone adjusted without discussion. Caden asked his first question when they reached the rocky outcropping that marked the first quarter of the day's distance. The eastern tributary. Does it run this time of year? She had mentioned the tributary in passing during their initial walk from camp, a single sentence about drainage patterns in the lower corridor. He had filed it and retrieved it, and was now asking about its tactical implications without framing it that way. Knee-high at this point in the season, Senna said. Fordable, but slow. If anyone needs to move fast through the lower section, they go around. How long around? 2 hours added, if you know where to step. 4, if you don't. He said nothing else for a while. She could feel him processing the answer the way she had felt it in camp. Not as something to respond to immediately, but as a piece being placed into a larger arrangement she couldn't fully see yet. By midday, the canopy had thickened to the point where the light on the path looked like something filtered through old cloth. The forest here was ancient in a way that affected how sound traveled, close and dense in one direction, suddenly open in another, with no visual explanation for the change. Senna knew the acoustics well enough to use them, and she did, twice, before the path began its first serious descent into the lower corridor terrain. The first deliberate deviation came in the early afternoon. She had been watching the movement patterns ahead for the better part of an hour. What she had actually detected was a shift in the bird activity 2 ridges east, the particular quality of silence that meant something large had recently passed through. Most likely a patrol from the smaller pack whose territory bordered the corridor on that side. Not a threat. Not worth breaking pace for. She took the group left anyway onto a narrow switchback that stayed within the valley-bound approach, but added 2 hours and brought them back to the main path at a different point. No explanation until Caden asked. Movement pattern on the eastern ridge, she said. Patrol. Not hostile to us, but large enough to slow us down if they wanted to exchange courtesies. He looked at the path they had rejoined, looked back at the way they had come. She watched him work through whether her read matched the terrain and the timing. All right, he said. That was the whole of it. No challenge, no second guessing. He had given her his trust with the straightforward completeness of someone who understood that trusting a guide meant trusting a guide, and performing doubt was just a way of doing the job badly. Senna walked on ahead of him and stared at the path and felt the trust land somewhere in her chest like a stone dropped into standing water. The detour had been tactical, and she had the terrain to justify it. The part she had not been honest with herself about was that she had also been watching for any sign that he would make the work harder out of rank, habit, or vanity, something petty or overbearing or dismissive that would have made what she was carrying easier to carry, a reason that had nothing to do with his guilt and everything to do with his character. He had not cooperated. Camp that first night was made in a depression between two ridges where the wind broke naturally and the tree cover was dense enough to make a fire reasonable. The warriors were efficient with the setup and had eaten and divided the watch before the last light was fully gone from the sky. Senna placed her bedroll at the perimeter edge, as she always did, for the combination of early warning advantage and the practical distance it maintained between herself and the rest of the group. It didn't matter. She had been lying still for perhaps half an hour, eyes open in the dark, running through the mental inventory she used when sleep was unlikely. Distances, timings, the surface conditions on the northern flank path she had not yet let herself think too carefully about, when she became aware that her body had oriented itself without her instruction, not obviously, not with any visible shift in position. But her attention had moved, the way attention moves when something changes in a room, and when she noticed where it had settled, she lay very still and assessed the fact of it. She was pointing toward him, toward the specific dark between two trees on the other side of camp where Caden had placed his bedroll, and her wolf was holding that bearing with a steadiness that had nothing to do with threat assessment and everything to do with something considerably more inconvenient. She knew what a mate bond felt like in theory. Every shifter did. She had never expected to feel one, had lived long enough without a pack or a marked mate to have made a kind of private peace with that absence. The bond was not supposed to work this way, immediate, directional, present, before any word had been exchanged about it, rooted in a certainty that bypassed all the usual processes of knowing someone. And yet her wolf held its bearing like it had always known where to point and had simply been waiting for proximity to confirm it. Senna closed her eyes, pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, breathed with the deliberateness of someone who has been underwater long enough to be careful about the first breath. Then she began, very methodically, building the wall between what she felt and what she was allowed to feel. And when she was done, she lay in the dark and stared at the canopy and waited for morning. Day 2 moved differently. The terrain in the middle section of the corridor was less consistent. Broken ground and lateral ridges that cut the path at angles, requiring constant adjustment. Senna worked harder here, reading 3 steps ahead, keeping her pace calculated to absorb the group's needs without making the calculation obvious. It was the kind of guiding that looked like it required no effort and required considerable effort. Caden stayed closer behind her than he had on the first day. She was aware of this in the specific way she was now aware of most things relating to him, her wolf tracking the change in distance with an interest she had not asked for. The attack came from the ravine on the left, before she had fully identified the source of the wrongness she had been reading in the undergrowth for the previous 10 minutes. 6 of them, coming fast from the ravine's lip with the disorganized aggression of rogues who had learned to hit quickly because they could not sustain a prolonged fight. They struck the middle of the group. The standard calculation aimed at separating the guard from whoever they were guarding. Senna had already moved, not toward safety, into the ravine. She had read the positions through the ground cover while the others were still registering the movement, and the smell of the rogues had given her their spread. 3 right, 2 left, 1 holding back as either a reserve or an exit. She went left, came around the flank of the second position while the warriors were engaging the right, and the 2 rogues there had just enough time to understand they had been outmaneuvered before that particular problem was resolved. It was fast, and it was not clean, and she did not allow herself to stop moving until she had come back up the ravine to the path and confirmed the status of the group. 2 warriors down, 1 with a gash across his shoulder that was bleeding heavily and moving badly, the other with a wound to his side that she assessed in 3 seconds as serious. The remaining 2 warriors had handled the right side rogues. Davin had taken down the one who had held back. Caden had not been reached. He was watching her when she came up from the ravine. Not with the assessment she had braced for, the recalibration of who she was now that she had displayed a capability he hadn't accounted for. What she saw was something quieter, more complete, as though a question he had been carrying since yesterday had just been answered, and the answer had been exactly what he had suspected it might be. The shoulder wound needs pressure now, Senna said. The side wound needs more than this camp can give. Agreed, Caden said. The serious wound was Bren, the one she had marked as gravest. His name she had learned over the campfire the previous evening. One of the 4 warriors, a man with the good sense to be quiet when he had nothing to say. He could walk, but not march, and the side wound would worsen over a full day's terrain. The decision was made quickly. Davin would take Bren back, along with Court, the second injured warrior, who needed attention even if his wound was less urgent. The 4th warrior had taken a wrenching blow to the knee in the scramble and could still stand, but would slow the group badly over the next day's terrain. Caden sent him back as well. They would use the switchback path Senna had mapped on the first day and make it back to the border camp within a day and a half. You'll be back before the 3rd morning? Caden asked Davin. Before noon of it, Davin said. The camp that night was smaller and quieter with 3 fewer people. Senna placed her bedroll again at the perimeter and sat watch for the first 2 hours, telling herself it was due diligence and knowing it was because the increased quiet made it harder to maintain the distance she needed. The Varek scout found the camp at the 2nd hour of her watch. She detected him 30 yards out, before he had cleared the tree line, before he had any angle on the camp itself. He was moving carefully, patient with his steps, which told her he was experienced. He was working downwind of where he expected the group to be, which told her he had knowledge of standard military camp layouts. And the scent on him was unmistakably Varek's territory. That cold river clay and char that she had identified in her house 2 nights ago. He had not seen anything yet. He was still approaching. Senna left her position in the direction opposite his approach, circled wide through the dark with her wolf's night vision and a silence that came from years of working terrain alone and came around behind him. It was over before he made a sound. She dragged him further from the camp and stayed there for a long time afterward, crouched in the dark with her hands braced on her knees and her breathing coming harder than the physical effort required. The scout would not report. Varek would receive nothing from the corridor tonight, would assume silence was operational necessity, would wait for the morning report. She had just eliminated the one mechanism that would have triggered Nell's death if she deviated from the valley route. She had done it cleanly and without hesitation, protecting Caden's group with the same instinct she had used in the ravine. And she could not determine whether the instinct had been hers or her wolf's, and had stopped being sure there was a difference. When she returned to the perimeter and resumed her watch, the camp was undisturbed. Caden's bearings still registered in the specific part of her awareness that she had walled off and which went on holding its position regardless of what she built around it. The 3rd warrior, a quiet man named Feld, took over the watch at the 3rd hour. Senna lay down on her bedroll and stared up through the canopy at the visible stars. The valley was half a day away. Davin would return by the 3rd morning. She had no scout to report her movements now, and more options than she had arrived at the corridor with, and less certainty about all of them than she had felt about anything in a long time. She lay in the dark and listened to the forest settle around her, and thought about the way Caden had looked at her after the ravine, and told herself she had 3 days, and she was going to use all of them. She was awake before the forest was. The dark before dawn in the corridor had its own texture, not the full dark of deep night, but something transitional, the color of water just before it becomes something you could call gray. Senna had been lying still for 2 hours with her eyes open, listening to Feld's breathing at the perimeter, and the distant movement of something large and unhurried deeper in the trees, and running the same set of calculations she had been running since the night she came home to find her door held open by strangers. She got up without sound and moved away from the camp. The thinking she needed to do was not thinking she could do lying still. It required the sharpened attention that walking in the dark produced. Her wolf's senses keeping the map of her immediate surroundings so that the part of her mind that worked in language and sequence could run through the variables without the body being involved. She had eliminated the scout. That changed the geometry. Varric would not receive a deviation report from the corridor because there was no one left in the corridor to send one. That meant the immediate trigger for Nell's death had been removed, and for approximately 18 hours after she had done it, she had allowed herself the dangerous comfort of thinking this meant she had options she previously lacked. She had spent the subsequent hours systematically dismantling that comfort. The deviation trigger was gone, yes, but it had only ever been one of 3 mechanisms. The second was time. Varric expected the Alpha King to arrive at the Valley Road's entry point on the morning of the 3rd day, and if he did not, Varric would eventually understand that something had gone wrong. The third was the completion of the route. She was contracted to deliver the group to the eastern post, which meant there would be a point at which Varric would expect confirmation and would not receive it. The window between removing the scout and either of those 2 mechanisms activating was not infinite. It was perhaps 2 days before Varric began making decisions based on absence of information rather than presence of it. And 2 days was not enough time to do what she had spent the entire night trying to find a way to do. She had mapped the corridor in the dark the way she mapped it in her sleep, complete, exact, with all the weight of everything she had walked and marked and memorized. Every path that bypassed the valley, every alternative route that reached the eastern post through the high ground or the eastern tributary crossing or the long arc around the northern face of the ridge. She had gone through each of them with the ruthlessness of someone who needed to find something they were not finding. The northern flank path was the one she kept returning to. She had walked it twice, once in dry season with light gear, once in early winter with worse conditions than current. It was narrow, exposed in 2 sections, and required a traversal across the high face above the valley that would be technically demanding for the remaining group. Caden, herself, and Feld, Davin was not yet back. 3 people, possible. The northern flank path also came out above and behind the ridgeline positions Varric had set. If it was used not simply as an alternate route, but as a tactical approach, it changed what was possible at the valley from underneath. She stopped walking, stood very still in the dark with that thought. Then she kept moving, because it was a thought that required Caden. And Caden was a complication she had been building walls against for 2 days, and before she could hand him that thought, she needed to know what she was handing him with it. The mate bond woke with her movement. It had been present since the first night, that bearing compass quality, the directional certainty that registered Caden's position relative to her own with the same precision her wolf used for terrain. In the dark and at distance, she felt it operating with a consistency that she had run out of ways to explain away as something other than what it was. When she had first recognized it in camp on the first night, the feeling had been something she could compare to horror, specific and cold and carrying the weight of terrible timing. Now, on the 3rd morning, moving through the dark alone with the camp behind her, it had changed in a way she had not expected and had not prepared for. It was no longer simply directional. It had become, and she took a long time to find the word, standing in a gap between 2 ancient oaks with the gray pre-dawn light beginning to separate itself from the dark above the canopy. It had become something that felt like concern, as though the bond had graduated from orientation to communication. And what it was communicating was that she had been away from the camp longer than was strictly necessary, and her wolf found this unreasonable. She turned back. The camp was as she had left it. Felled at the perimeter, Caden's position unchanged, the fire reduced to coals that gave off steady heat without light. She settled back onto her bedroll and lay with her hands on her chest and looked at the canopy and waited for the sky to commit to morning. She thought about Nell. Nell asleep in a fort a day northeast, with no knowledge of what was being done in her name. Nell, who was afraid of thunderstorms and had strong opinions about everything, and had trusted Senna with the specific, uncomplicated trust of someone who had never been given a reason not to. Nell, who had been 8 years old when they stopped having anyone else, and had adjusted to that fact with the matter-of-fact resilience of a child who had decided that what she had was sufficient, because it was what she had. Senna was not going to let that child pay for a decision Varric had made, and Senna had not yet found a way to reverse. The morning came gray and cold, and Davin arrived before the camp had fully broken with 2 new horses and a brisk accounting of the journey back. Bren was stable. Court's wound was being treated. He had moved fast, and the path had cooperated. "Good road?" Caden asked. "Good enough," Davin said, with the brevity of a man who considered anything above fatal to fall within an acceptable range. The full group was now Senna, Caden, Davin, and Feld. 4 people, moving through the final section of the corridor toward a fork that was 2 hours ahead and would require a decision she had not yet made. She led them on the path and thought about the northern flank and the formation she had passed above the valley during her second traverse of that route. A geological shelf of compressed shale layered over loose granite beneath. Running along the upper ridgeline, directly above where Varek's positions would be set. She had noted it the first time she walked it as a navigational hazard. She noted it now differently. She was still thinking about it when she heard Caden's footstep behind her change cadence. And then he was beside her rather than behind her, not moving past, just adjusting his position to walk level with her in the section where the path was briefly wide enough to allow it. He did not say anything immediately. He walked beside her for a long enough time that it became clear he was not about to ask a tactical question. "You went out before dawn," he said finally. Not an accusation. A statement that had been filed and held and was now being presented. "Reconnaissance habit," Senna said. He looked at the path ahead of them. "I know." There was something in those 2 words that she was not equipped to examine right now, and she did not examine them. The high ground began at the last ridge before the valley section. From the trail's upper angle, through a gap in the tree cover, the path descended toward the fork. And beyond it, the beginning of the valley road's entry stretch. Even from this distance, from this angle, she could read what she had been reading in her mind for 2 days. She had not expected him to read it at the same time. He stopped walking. She stopped a half step after. They stood in the gap in the trees and looked down at the terrain below, and the silence between them carried the specific weight of 2 people arriving at the same understanding by different routes. The valley's ridgeline was visible from here. Not the positions themselves, which were well concealed, but the effect of the positions, the way the vegetation had been disturbed in patterns that had no natural explanation, the particular shape of prepared ground that someone who had spent time in military terrain could identify without being told what they were looking at. She counted her own heartbeats. 12, 13. "How long have you known?" he said. Flat. Not the anger she had been bracing for, but something more contained and therefore harder to read. Her wolf pressed against her ribs. The bearing held steady. "Since before the corridor," she said. He said nothing. She did not tell him everything. Not yet. They were still in the open, still on a path where the acoustics were wrong for the conversation she could feel coming. But she told him enough. The shape of it, the positions, the mechanism. She watched his face as he processed it and saw the calculation working behind the amber gold of his eyes, and felt, with a clarity that surprised her, that she did not want to be on the opposite side of that calculation. He looked at her once when she stopped talking. The look lasted long enough to be something other than assessment. "Tonight," he said. "At camp." She nodded. He moved back to his position behind her, and she moved forward on the path. And the fork waited 2 hours ahead, and she took the left-hand trail without marking it as a deviation. A variation that kept them on terrain consistent with a delayed approach to the same destination, adding half a day, but not the suspicious kind of half-day, the kind that could be explained by the practical demands of the route. Neither Davin nor Feld commented. When they made camp that evening in the hollowed depression above the fork, Davin came to find her at the perimeter before she had settled. He doubled the watch, Davin said without preamble, positioned them specifically on the western approach, not the standard perimeter. He looked at her with the calm assessment of a beta who had long practice at reading situations through their edges. He didn't explain his reasoning. Senna looked at the western approach, then at the camp, then at Caden, who was crouched at the fire with Feld, speaking in a low voice about something that was clearly not what he was thinking about. He had doubled the watch on the western approach. The western approach was the direction from which anyone sent by Varek would come, if Varek had received word that his scout was missing and had sent someone to check. She had not told Caden about the scout. She had told him only the shape of the valley ambush. He had inferred the rest. Had inferred it, and had not said so, and had quietly positioned his people to cover for a threat he had identified by working backward from incomplete information. And he had done it without making her aware that he had done it because he was protecting her from something he had not named. She stood at the perimeter for a long time after Davin walked away. The mate bond was not subtle now. It had not been subtle since the previous night, and it was substantially less subtle now, pressing against her awareness with the kind of insistence that makes a person understand that the distance they have been maintaining has been purchased on borrowed time. Her wolf held its bearing, held the warmth of him against the dark like a fixed point. She pressed the back of her hand against her sternum and breathed. The fork was behind them. The northern flank path branched off the main route at a point she could reach before dawn if she moved at first light. The formation above the valley positions was a fact she had been holding separate for 2 days and which had become something else in the last several hours. Not a geological hazard to navigate around, but something that wanted to be used. She sat against the perimeter tree and looked at the dark and did not sleep. The valley waited ahead. Nell waited northeast. Caden's bearing registered in her chest with the consistency of breathing, steady and present, and requiring nothing from her except that she stopped pretending it was not there. She stopped pretending it was not there. She did not act on it. She sat with it instead, which was harder, and she mapped the northern face of the ridge for what she calculated was the 37th time. And she let herself think about what 4 people with the element of surprise and the right terrain and a formation of compressed shale above granite could do to 100 waiting men who had never considered that someone might come from above. The morning would come, and she would tell him everything. What she was going to tell him first, she had not yet decided. But she was going to tell him. The dark held, and the camp was quiet, and she watched the western approach until the first gray light began separating itself from the black in the east, and nothing came out of the dark toward them. The watch held. Caden's doubled perimeter held. She thought about what it meant that he had built her a wall she had not known she needed, without telling her he had done it. Then she stopped thinking about it and started thinking about shale. The dawn came without ceremony. Gray light pressed through the canopy in the slow, indifferent way of early mornings in the deep corridor, the kind that asked nothing of the people below it and offered nothing in return except the fact of its arrival. Senna was already awake and had been for most of the night. She sat at the edge of the dead fire with her hands around a cup of water that had long since gone cold, and watched the light change and understood that the particular kind of waiting she had been doing for 3 days was finished. She set the cup down, stood, walked to where Caden was. He was already awake. She had known he would be. The bond had been tracking his state of rest, or the absence of it, with the same consistency it tracked everything else. And what it had reported through most of the night was the quality of stillness that belongs to someone lying with their eyes open. He was sitting against a tree at the far edge of the camp's informal boundary, with one knee raised and his forearms resting across it, looking at the middle distance with the contained patience of a man who had been waiting for something to come to him and had decided not to go looking for it. He looked at her when she stopped in front of him. Not surprised, not guarded. He simply looked at her and waited. She sat down on the ground a few feet away and looked at the same middle distance he had been looking at and told him everything. She did not ask for anything before she started, and she did not allow herself to manage the telling the way she had spent 3 days mentally rehearsing. She had learned, somewhere in the hours of the previous night, that managing the telling was a way of protecting herself that she no longer had the right to. She told him flat and in sequence, the way she described terrain, what it was, where it was, why it mattered. Varick's men at her door, Nell taken north to the fort, the valley road and the 100 men positioned on the ridgeline, the scout she had found at the camp perimeter on the second night, and what she had done about him and why. The information she had pulled from Varick's man before he fled her house, the scheme against the smaller packs, the assassinations disguised as rogue attacks, the territorial absorption, the names she had been given for the men inside Caden's council. She stopped when she had said everything there was to say. The middle distance looked the same as it had when she started. The corridor held its silence around them, with the thoroughness of a place that had seen enough of human difficulty to find none of it especially remarkable. Caden did not speak immediately. She was not sure what she had expected from him in this moment. She had imagined the anger version, and the cold version, and the version where what she said was weighed against what she had done over 3 days and found insufficient. She had not imagined this, the quality of stillness that settled over him now, which was nothing like the stillness of restraint. It was the stillness of a man receiving information and organizing it, the way water fills a vessel, finding the shape of the container without drama. When he finally spoke, the first thing he said was, "How large is the fort?" She blinked once. Expanded over the original structure, stone foundation, timber upper levels. 2 main gates, eastern approach the weaker of the 2. The northern face has a section of wall that was rebuilt last season. Different stone, different mortar. How many guards? The man I spoke to said rotating watch, never fewer than 12 on the walls. More inside. Nell's location within it. He didn't know specifically. He said high-value guests were kept in the eastern wing. She paused. He said guests. I didn't correct him. Caden looked at the eastern wing of the information she had given him in the same way she might look at the eastern face of a physical structure, measuring it, finding its angles. The eastern approach being the weaker gate and the eastern wing holding high-value prisoners. That's either convenient or a trap within a trap. Varek is methodical, Senna said. He keeps what he values close to the exit he controls. A short silence. How far to the fort? Hard march from here, running straight northeast. Full day. Faster with fresh horses and someone who doesn't need to be careful about being seen. He absorbed this. Then he looked at her directly, for the first time since she had sat down. The amber gold of his eyes in the early gray light was something she made herself hold without flinching. "The scout," he said. "You eliminated him to protect the route." "Yes." "Which route?" She recognized the question for what it was, not asking her to explain what she had protected, but asking her to tell him she had already found a way through before she came to him. He had heard the scout detail and understood its implication before she finished the sentence. "The northern flank path," she said. "Above the valley. I've walked it twice. It's narrow and technically demanding, but it's passable for a small group. It comes out above and behind the ridgeline positions and approaches the valley from that angle. Above it, there's a formation of compressed shale layered over loose granite on the upper ridgeline, directly above where Varek's men will be positioned. I marked it as a navigational hazard the first time I walked the path. It's not stable. The right kind of force at the right point would bring a significant portion of it down onto the positions below." She watched him work through the geometry of it. She had been working through it herself for 2 days and still found the precision of the calculation satisfying in the clean way that a difficult problem correctly solved is always satisfying, regardless of what surrounds it. "You'd need force applied at a specific point," he said. "There's signaling powder in the travel kit. Davin carries 2 units for emergency use. Combined with dry torch material and applied at the fault line, I can identify from the path. Yes, it would not be a certain outcome, but it would force evacuation of the valley positions. They'd scatter downslope. And while they scatter, we move through the high face and come down the northern side into the approach road for the eastern post. We arrive from the wrong direction and the right outcome." Davin had come awake at some point during this conversation and had positioned himself within earshot with the professional tactfulness of a beta who understood when information was more valuable than privacy. He did not pretend he had not been listening. "The fort retrieval," he said, from his position against the adjacent tree. "You and Feld," Caden said, without the pause of a man still deciding. "Eastern approach. The wall section with new mortar is the point of entry, not the gate. Get in, get the girl, get out before any word from this direction arrives." "Time window," Davin said. Senna did the calculation. "Varek expects the ambush activated by midday today. When it isn't, he'll wait before sending a messenger north. He'll assume delay, weather, some operational variance. You have a window of approximately 6 to 8 hours before he begins to doubt." "I can be inside that window," Davin said. "Take the horses," Caden told him. "Both of them. Feld runs the terrain well. Use that." He looked at Davin with the brevity of 2 people who have trusted each other long enough that instructions arrive pre-compressed. "Get her back safe." Davin nodded once and went to get Feld. The camp broke in less time than she would have thought possible. Davin and Feld moved northeast at a pace that spoke to years of covering difficult ground under urgency. Senna watched them go until the corridor closed over the direction they had taken. and then she turned back to the matter of the northern flank. She and Caden redistributed the travel kit between them. The signaling powder came in 2 sealed leather cases, dense and dry, designed to produce high-intensity flame from limited material. She had calculated the required volume against the fault line's dimensions twice. It was enough, possibly more than enough, which was the kind of margin she preferred when working with forces she could not retract once committed. "Show me the path," Caden said. She showed him the path. It branched off the main trail at a junction she had passed twice without marking visibly. A junction that looked like the natural end of usable terrain to anyone who had not already walked what came after it. The path itself was no more than a track made by deer, and occasionally by the kind of person who needed to move through the corridor without being on any surface another person might think to watch. It climbed immediately, switching back across the face of the ridge in short, tight angles that demanded attention to foot placement and offered nothing in the way of reassurance. Caden moved behind her without comment and without difficulty. She had not expected him to struggle. She had seen him move in the ravine when the rogues hit the group, and the grace of it had been the grace of a body that had been asked hard things over a long time and had agreed to most of them. But she found herself noting how he handled the specific demands of the northern flank, the way he read the surface a step ahead and adjusted with a naturalness that went past training into something closer to instinct. Her wolf, predictably, had opinions about this. She declined to engage with them. The climb took the better part of 2 hours. The light was still morning quality when they reached the high traversal, the exposed section she had been most concerned about, a 50-yard stretch across bare rock face with the valley visible below and the wind finding every gap in her clothing with the thoroughness of something that had been doing this for centuries and found it trivial. She moved across it steadily and without looking down, which was what the surface demanded, and Caden moved across it the same way. On the far side of the traversal, the path descended into a shelf of rock and sparse vegetation that ran along the upper ridgeline. She could see from this angle the valley floor below. She could see the concealment arrangements in the undergrowth, the disturbed pattern of deliberately flattened vegetation, the geometry of prepared positions. 100 men waiting for a group of 6 that was now a group of 2. The patience of the prepared ambush had a particular quality from above that she did not find impressive. She found the fault line. It was exactly where she had placed it in memory. A vertical seam running through the compressed shale face, 8 feet across at the top and narrowing below, with the looser granite beneath showing through in 2 places where the surface had already begun the process of natural failure. She assessed it the way she assessed terrain, what it was, what it would do when asked, how much it would require. "Here," she said, and indicated the 2 application points she had identified. Caden looked at the fault line, looked at the positions below, did the geometry. "Both units," he said. "Both units," she agreed. The preparation was careful and took longer than she would have preferred. The powder needed to be packed into the fault's upper seam in a specific distribution, not simply applied, but placed to direct the force downward rather than outward, which required working the seam with the narrow blade of her knife to create the necessary cavity. Caden held the torch material steady while she packed, and they did not speak during this, which was the appropriate condition for work that demanded precision. She lit the fuse from a position 20 feet back, behind a stable granite outcropping with sufficient mass to be definite shelter. The fuse was cut to give them 30 seconds. She pressed herself against the granite beside Caden and counted. The sound the formation made when it went was not the sharp crack she had half expected. It was something lower and more fundamental. A percussive compression that moved through the rock she was pressed against before the audible wave reached them, a sensation in the chest wall and the jaw and the soles of the feet simultaneously. Then the sound arrived. Then, a moment later, the secondary sound of the shale face releasing the granite beneath it in a sustained and deliberate cascade. A fall that kept going longer than its initial impulse and which, from the positions below, would have presented as a wall of rock and displaced earth descending the ridgeline with the speed of something that had been waiting for permission. The noise from the valley positions that followed was not difficult to interpret. She came around the granite outcropping and looked down. The valley floor was a state of rapid reorganization, The 100 positions were no longer positions. They were people moving downslope with the urgency of men who had just had the ridgeline above them try to fall on them. The concealment arrangements were gone, scattered by the cascade or abandoned by the people who had been maintaining them. The valley was open. "Move," Caden said. They moved. The descent on the northern side of the traversal was faster than the ascent had been. Not careless, but driven by the specific momentum of a plan executing within its own window. She knew every step of this section, had placed it in memory with the same precision as everything else, and she moved through it with Caden, matching her pace in a way that stopped feeling like two people navigating terrain together and started feeling like something with a single shared rhythm. The approach road to the eastern post came up through the northern descent like a statement of fact. Wide, clear, the kind of road that had been maintained because it was used. They came onto it from the wrong direction for anyone Varric had briefed, and the right direction for the Alpha King's stated purpose, and they walked the remaining distance through a morning that had become unreasonably clear for what had occurred in it. The eastern post was smaller than its name suggested, a fortified waypoint rather than a settlement, with a garrison of 20 and the particular alertness of people who received very few official visits and therefore paid close attention to the ones they received. The garrison commander came to meet them at the gate with the expression of a man calibrating rapidly between what he had been told to expect and what had arrived. Caden gave him the documentation from the mission's stated purpose and a summary of events that was accurate in its substance and entirely controlled in its framing. The commander received it with the careful attention of someone who would be writing his own report shortly and wished to be in the correct register. Senna stood 2 steps back and watched Caden handle it, and thought about Davin and Feld moving northeast at a hard march, and the eastern wing of a fort that kept its valued guests close to the exit it controlled, and the 6 to 8 hour window she had calculated and which was now being used. She thought about Nell. She thought about what Nell's face would look like when the door of whatever room she was in opened and the person on the other side was not a guard. The commander provided them with a room and a meal that neither of them discussed, but both consumed in full, which was the sensible response to having crossed a ridgeline traversal and executed a structural collapse before midday. The room was spare and practical and overlooked the garrison courtyard where 2 guards moved through their watch rotation with the unchanging rhythm of people who had done this enough times that the routine had become structural. By nightfall, there was still no sign of Davin or Feld. Senna made herself account for the timing instead of feeding the part of her mind that wanted to turn waiting into catastrophe. They had gone out at dawn on a full day's hard ride to the fort, and even done perfectly, the return would push into the following day. She slept in fragments and came back to the courtyard before noon. She was in the courtyard late the next afternoon when Davin arrived. She knew before the gate opened, felt the particular shape of the arrival through something that operated below identification. Her wolf recognizing the movement pattern of someone known before her eyes had confirmed it. Davin rode through the gate, with Feld beside him and Nell behind Feld on the horse, holding onto his jacket with the fierce grip of someone who has decided that whatever is happening, she is going to hold on. Nell saw Senna at the same moment Senna moved toward her. She was off the horse before Feld had fully stopped, which was either very nimble or not remotely safe. And then she was across the courtyard. And then she was in Senna's arms, with her face pressed into Senna's shoulder, and the grip of someone making a comprehensive structural claim. Senna held her. She did not say anything for a long moment. Her chin rested on the top of Nell's head, and her eyes were closed, and her wolf was doing something it had not done in years. Something quiet and certain, and without the edge of anything that needed managing. Just the fact of what was held and the fact of it being intact. "I knew you'd come," Nell said into her shoulder. Senna breathed. "You did. You always come." Across the courtyard, Caden stood near the garrison door and looked at them with an expression she would have needed more time and less complicated circumstances to examine. She did not examine it now. She held her sister and let the day settle around them and did not think about tomorrow yet. Tomorrow was there. It would wait. The road north to Caden's central territory took 4 days. 4 days of controlled pace carried them out of post-corridor terrain and onto the broader roads of Caden's territory. Nell spent most of the first day beside Feld, questioning him with brisk, methodical curiosity about the capital, his service, and whether the castle actually had a library. Feld answered with the patience of a man who had not expected to enjoy the experience and was revising that view in real time. Senna watched from 2 horse lengths back and felt relief arrive the way it often did after danger. Late, quiet, and stubborn enough to be believed. Caden rode ahead and kept every conversation in the register of logistics. She told herself that was restraint rather than distance. Her wolf offered different interpretations with increasing confidence. They were 2 hours from the border of his central territory when her wolf went alert. Not the alert of perceived threat ahead, the alert of perceived surveillance from the right flank, a lateral monitoring that had been building for the last quarter mile in the way that careful, patient watching builds before it becomes action. She did not change her pace or her posture. She moved her eyes across the tree line in the way that looks like nothing and reads everything. 4 positions, possibly 5. Close enough together to be coordinated, far enough apart to cover the road width in any direction. Varek's men moved like people who had been briefed carefully and expected a clean removal rather than a fight. The road was isolated here, the next garrison waypoint a full hour ahead, and the group was smaller than it had been at the corridor's start. She pulled her horse to a stop. Caden stopped a beat after her. Over the last 4 days, he had learned what her stops meant. Right flank, she said, at a volume calibrated for the group and not for the tree line. 5 positions, 40 yards. They've been tracking us for the last quarter mile. Davin had his weapon drawn before she finished the sentence. Feld moved between the tree line and Nell without hesitation. Caden looked at the trees, then at Senna. Number. 5 confirmed. Could be a 6th holding back as reserve. They want a clean grab, not a confrontation. The forward 2 will move first. Can you take the left approach? Yes. What followed was brief and decisive. The first 2 men came out of the tree line, expecting a target, and found themselves on the wrong side of the confrontation. She took the left approach, while Caden and Davin secured the road and Feld held position with Nell. The 5th man broke and ran. He made it 15 yards. The reserve emerged at the moment of maximum distraction and was already lifting his weapon when Senna crossed the distance and ended the problem before it finished becoming one. Varek was not among them. He had sent 6 men to do a clean removal and miscalculated the same factor that had undone every plan of his since the corridor began. He had not accounted for her. The man Davin had secured in the road was the one who knew where Varek had positioned himself while his team operated, a day's ride east, in a way station he used for operations he did not want traceable to his fort. He gave the location with the practicality of someone who had just watched 5 of his colleagues have a very bad afternoon and was updating his assessment of available options. Caden sent 2 riders ahead to the nearest garrison with the location and an authority seal that would bring the garrison's full complement to the way station before nightfall. Varek was apprehended before the sun finished setting. Senna learned this 2 days later when she was already within the walls of Caden's central territory, and the news arrived by fast rider with the particular clipped efficiency of official confirmation. She was in the eastern courtyard when the rider came, doing nothing more significant than watching Nell navigate an argument with a stable hand about the correct way to brush a horse. Nell was wrong about the brushing technique and correct about the way she was choosing to prosecute the argument, which Senna found more instructive about her sister's character than either participant intended. She read the confirmation and let the information settle. It settled like the end of a weight she had been so accustomed to carrying that its absence was its own kind of adjustment. Not relief, exactly. Something more specific, the particular stillness of a thing that has been held under tension finally being allowed to find its own level. The weeks that followed were easier in structure and harder in other ways. Senna had expected to be managed with careful courtesy until the question of what to do with her was resolved. Caden did no such thing. He gave her and Nell rooms because rooms were needed, brought her into council because the case required her, and expected competence from her with the same directness he expected it from everyone else. She found that much harder to keep distance from than politeness would have been. He appeared in the training yard in the mornings, never with her and never intruding, simply working in the same space at the same hour until that, too, became part of the castle's structure. The mate bond had changed again. It had been directional at first, then present, then quietly insistent. In the castle, it became a constant, not dramatic, not disruptive, just the steady cost of maintaining a position she no longer entirely believed in. Every morning in the yard, every council session, every evening meal in the hall, where everyone else had already begun treating her place beside him as established. She felt him the way a person feels water running somewhere inside a house. Not loud, but structural enough that its absence would have changed the shape of the silence. Nell was fine. This was the fact she returned to most often when she was doing the accounting of what was true and what she was uncertain about. Nell had established a working relationship with the castle's head archivist within 5 days of arrival, by the straightforward method of being intensely interested in the archive's contents and entirely willing to do the organizational work that the archivist had been putting off for 2 years. She ate regularly and slept without apparent difficulty, and had developed a quiet, ongoing assessment of everyone in the castle that she communicated to Senna in the evenings in the form of brief, accurate character summaries delivered with the confidence of someone who found people legible. "Davin likes you," Nell said, approximately 3 weeks in, with the tone of someone reporting a fact they had confirmed through sufficient observation. "Davin is professional," Senna said. Nell gave her the look she reserved for positions she considered technically arguable, but fundamentally evasive. She said nothing further, which was its own commentary. Varick's formal judgment came on a morning in the 6th week. The hearing was attended by 6 pack alphas who held territory bordering or adjacent to the affected routes, the council members whose names Senna had provided, and a formal witness assembly that included Senna herself. She gave her accounting in clear, complete sentences with the documentation she had compiled. What she had been told, what she had observed, what she had inferred, and why. The men whose names she had provided from Varick's informant in her house sat in the council seats and listened to their own positions in the scheme described in specific detail. Varick received exile. His pack's formal dissolution was secondary. Without a recognized alpha, the pack structure collapsed into its component members, who were absorbed into adjacent territories or left to establish themselves independently under the oversight of the regional alphas. The territory his scheme had absorbed was returned. The council members whose positions had been compromised were removed. She walked out of the hearing into the long corridor that connected the council wing to the eastern yard and stood in the cold air and thought about nothing in particular for a long moment. The bond was a steady warmth in her chest. She was aware of Caden still in the council chamber behind her, and aware of the distance between them, and aware that she had been constructing reasons to maintain that distance for 6 weeks, and that the reasons had progressively less structural integrity. She made her decision that evening. She packed the same bag she had arrived with. She had acquired nothing in 6 weeks that could not be carried in the same pack, and was in the eastern gate passage before the castle had fully settled into its nighttime quiet. She was not leaving Nell behind without a word. She had stepped out because she needed air and distance enough to decide whether she was walking for an hour or changing the shape of both their lives, and she had not yet found words she was willing to bring back to Nell's door. The bag was a concession to possibility, not a finished choice. Caden was in the road, not at the gate. In the road beyond it, 60 feet from the gate's threshold, standing in the dark with no lamp and no visible reason for being there, except that he was there. He was facing away from her when she came through the gate. He turned when her footsteps reached him. She stopped. He looked at her bag, looked at her face. The amber gold of his eyes in the dark held the things she had been trying not to name for 6 weeks, not assessment, not calculation. The look of someone who had decided to say a true thing. "You led me through the corridor for 3 days," he said, "knowing what you knew. You eliminated the scout that would have confirmed your deviation to Varick, which meant Nell's safety was now entirely contingent on your own ability to find a solution. You took that on alone, at night, without telling me." She said nothing. "On the 4th morning, when you had options you didn't have before, you came to me before the camp broke. Not after. Not when we were already at the fork and the decision was being forced." He took 1 step. "You could have used the northern flank path without telling me what it was for. I would have followed. I was following your read on the corridor and everything. You chose to tell me the whole of it, knowing what it would cost you. I needed your resources for the plan," she said. "You needed Davin and Feld to reach the fort," he agreed. "You didn't need to tell me about Varick's scheme. You didn't need to give me the names in my council. That was not required by the plan, and you gave it to me anyway." The road was quiet around them. The cold was the clean cold of a clear night, not uncomfortable if a person was standing rather than walking. She was standing and appeared to have stopped moving entirely. "I was in debt to you," she said. The information settled the debt. Senna. It was the first time he had said her name that way. Not as identification, not as the address that precedes a tactical question. As a thing complete in itself. Her wolf pressed against her ribs with the steady insistence of 6 weeks of maintained distance, and she felt the wall she had been building begin to lose its argument. "I watched you in the ravine," he said. "I watched you work. I watched you before dawn for 3 mornings, going out alone to find a solution that would let everyone come through. I watched you in the Eastern Post courtyard with your sister." He stopped. "Let that sit. I have been watching you for 6 weeks do everything in your considerable power to decide whether what you offered me on that 4th morning was a debt payment or something else." "It was a debt payment," she said. It came out less certain than she intended. "Then why are you standing in this road at this hour instead of still inside?" She opened her mouth, closed it. The bond was not subtle. It had not been subtle in weeks. It pressed against everything she had built against it with the patience of something that understood that patience was what the situation required and had no shortage of it. Her wolf had been holding its bearing since the first night in the corridor and had not once, through all 6 weeks and all her careful construction of reasons, adjusted its position. She set her bag down in the road, not as a statement, as a practical response to the fact that she was apparently not going anywhere right now, and the bag was heavy, and she had been carrying it for 6 weeks in one form or another, and she was tired of the weight. Caden looked at the bag. Something in the line of his jaw changed. "I almost got you killed," she said. "That's a fact that doesn't change." "You chose not to," he said. "Every day for 3 days, you chose not to, in conditions where it would have been entirely understandable to make a different choice. Your sister's life against a stranger's." A pause. "That's also a fact that doesn't change." She looked at him for a long moment in the dark. The road was empty in both directions. The cold was clean, and the stars were clear, and the bond between them was the single most constant thing she had felt in years, steady and directional, and entirely without the quality of demand. It simply knew what it knew, and had been waiting for her to stop arguing with it. "I don't know how to do this," she said. It was the truest thing she had said in 6 weeks, possibly longer. "I know," he said. "That's all right." He looked at her bag in the road. She looked at it too. Then she picked it up, not because she was leaving, but because leaving it in the road seemed like an incomplete decision, and she had spent enough of the last 6 weeks making incomplete decisions. "The claiming," she said, not a question, not a refusal. "Something in between." "When you're ready," he said. "Not before." She thought about the bond and the 6 weeks and the training yard in the mornings, and Nell in the archive, and the road stretching back toward the corridor, and the road stretching forward toward whatever came after this. She thought about what it felt like to have the bearing that had been fixed in her chest since the first night finally stop requiring active resistance. "The moon is full in 4 days," she said. "It is," he said. She stood in the road with her bag and looked at him and felt the wall come down. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way of something that has simply been decided and allows the held tension to release, quietly and completely, because the decision is made. She went back through the gate. The castle was quiet. The eastern wing was lit at one window. Nell, still awake with something from the archive, because Nell had inherited the habit of treating sleep as optional when there was information available. Senna stopped outside her door. She knocked. Nell opened it immediately, holding a bound ledger against her chest, and looked at the bag in Senna's hand with the expression of someone whose assessment of the situation updated very quickly. "You came back," Nell said. "I didn't go anywhere," Senna said. Nell looked at the bag, looked at Senna's face. The expression that settled on her was not surprise. It was the expression of someone whose prior assessment had just been confirmed. "Good," she said, and stepped back to let her in. 2 months after Varek's exile, the Eastern Wing of the Council had a new formal position, Senior Intelligence Advisor, Field Operations. The appointment had been made on the basis of demonstrated competency in active field assessment, informant management, and territorial knowledge. Stated in those terms, in that order, without reference to anything else. Senna had read the formal document twice before she understood that it meant what it said. She sat on the council because she had earned the seat. Nell sat in the archive 3 mornings a week because the archivist had determined that the organizational system Nell had built in the first month was superior to the previous one and had formalized the arrangement on those grounds. Varek's dissolved territories had been redistributed under regional alpha oversight. The pack members who had served him without knowledge of the scheme had been absorbed into adjacent packs without prejudice. The ones who had known were addressed through the formal process Caden ran with the same directness he brought to everything. Precise, without excess, without theater. The mate bond in its complete form was nothing like she had expected. She had expected the easing of resistance, the relief of tension released. What she found instead was the word she had been reaching for since the night in the road. Clarity was the closest she could get. The condition of a mind that has stopped managing 2 contradictory things at once and discovers that what returns is not comfort, but attention. The capacity to be present in a situation without a portion of herself engaged in maintenance work elsewhere. She sat in the morning training yard before the castle woke and worked through her forms in the clean, cold air, and felt the bond as a warmth that had no edge to it, no demand, no directional urgency. It simply existed, the way orientation exists in a person who knows where they are. Caden came through the yard door at the same hour he always did. She did not stop what she was doing. He did not expect her to. He moved to his own side of the yard and began his own work, and the morning held them both with the comfortable indifference of a place that has seen enough routine to find this one unremarkable. She worked through her forms. The cold air moved through the yard in the particular way of autumn mornings in this territory. Somewhere in the castle, Nell was probably already awake and already arguing with the archive about something. Senna finished her forms and stood still for a moment in the center of the yard, breathing evenly, and let the morning be what it was.